Good evening, everyone. It's so nice to see you here. I am Lisa Fishman. I am the Ruth Gordon Shapiro Class of 1937 Director of the Davis Museum at Wellesley College. It's great to have you with us this evening. Tonight we're in for a treat as we welcome back photographer Tabitha Soren, whose work is on view. 20 pieces of her ongoing surface tension project are on view in the Morel Lasky Levine Works on Paper Gallery at the Davis through June 9th. Tabitha and I were introduced by a mutual friend in August of 2017. She invited me to her hotel room to see her portfolio of works. And it was, as you can imagine, a very funny, lively encounter. And I was struck by the clever, moving, and beautiful juxtapositions that are so important to the surface tension project, by the contradictory forces at play and the humanistic point of view. We were immediately simpatico, and in the ways that I would say a curator and an artist can only hope to be. I have been lucky to work with her on curating the exhibition on view, and I hope you will all see it if you haven't been already. Tabitha Soren, who was born in San Antonio and now lives and works in the Bay Area, is a former Peabody Award-winning journalist for MTV and NBC News. Her photographs are held in many private and public collections, including the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, the New Orleans Museum of Art, the George Eastman Museum of Photography, the Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive, the Cleveland Museum of Art, the Oakland Museum of California, and San Francisco's Pier 24. Soren's first monograph, Fantasy Life, was published by Aperture Books in April of 2017. Her photography has been featured in The New Yorker, on the cover of the New York Times Magazine, in Vanity Fair, the Paris Review, the New York Review of Books, New York Magazine, Sports Illustrated, and California Sunday Magazine, among others. The Surface Tension exhibition at the Davis has been generously supported by Wellesley College Friends of Art, the Alice Gertrude Spink Art Fund of 1963, and the anonymous class of 1970 endowed Davis Museum Program Fund. Tonight, Tabitha Soren is in conversation with Carrie Cushman, the Linda Wyatt Gruber Class of 1966 Curatorial Fellow in Photography. Carrie arrived at the Davis in September of last year and has jumped into her role with gusto. A specialist in Japanese photography, she has immersed herself in the Davis's photography collection. She has taken on curatorial projects with zest and zeal. Tabitha and Carrie met through the Davis, and in the ways that curators and artists with shared interests always do, they have lots to talk about. We will be the beneficiaries of their conversation, and afterwards we will have the opportunity to ask questions here and informally at the reception in the Davis lobby. Please join me in welcoming Tabitha Soren and Carrie Cushman.
To be clear, I don't go around inviting curators to my hotel room, but the air conditioning of the hotel lobby was out, so I really had no choice. I was actually a little embarrassed about it.
Okay. Well, thank you, Lisa, for that generous introduction. Indeed, we do have a lot to talk about, and we thought we'd take this opportunity tonight. We're going to start with Surface Tension, which is currently on view at the Davis, and then introduce you to some of Tabitha's other work so that you can become more familiar with her career and work as a photographer. We'll talk for about 45 minutes and then open it up to questions from you all. So I want to start with big picture in relationship to surface tension. Wondering why photography, what you hope to achieve with photography, and how those goals come through specifically in surface tension.
Well, I think photography is my medium of choice at the moment because I came from working in television, and that medium was, at the time I was doing it, was 30 frames a second, so it wasn't that much of a leap for me to single out one frame at a time. But for me, I also really love the way that I can try to explore all of the anarchic complexity of the human experience with photography. I don't know. I just feel like at this moment in our contemporary culture that our differences are being used as a way to divide us. And I have this tendency behind a camera to try to expose the psychological aspects of day-to-day life. So the morbidity, the dread, the anxiety, all the things that all of us deal with on a daily basis but don't necessarily talk about on the surface. I think that with any luck, maybe after looking at my work, that it would be a point of commonality between viewers. I think that people who make art or collect art are trying to escape the sort of ordinary aspects of life and sort of conjuring up ideas to transcend a quotidian experience. And for me, photography does that because it takes these little moments that could disappear or you could forget about, and it freezes them. It's wonderful at taking something ephemeral and transgressing that temporality. So I feel like it enables me to make the invisible visible. And what can be seen with the eye is not all there is. That's not really my quote, but someone said that. And so surface tension in that way, specifically with photography, I'm thinking about all the images that everyone takes and shares. And in this case, in this slide, it really does overlap with sort of an index of how Americans specifically are spending their time. And the studies, there have been 2 or 3 studies that show that porn and cat videos are the 2 most time-consuming elements, which is amusing at first, but then if you really think about it, it's like a pretty intimate experience with pets. People who don't have children, or even people who do have children, often think of their animals as another child, and I don't really understand why you'd want to spend time with a virtual version of that intimate experience, but they are doing so. And then another, just to diverge just a little bit, another study actually went further and showed that serotonin levels go up after 20 minutes of watching cat videos if you're a cat person. You have to be a cat person, which I'm not. So anyway, I'm more interested in the desires that are underneath, that are shaping these decisions to spend time in this way. And I also think that photography really appeals to me because I think people need at this moment to, they use photographs to verify their experiences, to believe their own emotions, and they're tools for their own narratives. So I think of them much more than just a way to hold on to memories.
Do you want to talk a little bit about the goals and surface tension and
Sure.
what the you talked about wanting to freeze the invisible. So what's the invisible here that you're trying to get at in surface tension?
The invisible, there's several layers to that, which must happen when you work on something for too many years, I guess. But for me, I'm trying to explore the difficulty or the lack of desire to distinguish between reality and fiction. So if you're spending all your time paying attention to what's on your screen, and I am part of this, I spend hours in Photoshop and emailing and all the rest, you are how you spend your attention, really. That's what, if you come down to it, that's what you're deciding to do. So one of the things that we don't see that I'm taking pictures of is, if everybody has a phone in their hand, if you look at the phone and put it in some light, assuming you haven't just wiped it off on your jeans, you will see a lot of the markings that are on these screens. And what I'm doing is shooting it with an 8x10 camera, so you have an incredible amount of detail, and side lighting it in a very professional way, so all of that grime and that those markings are very pronounced, and then blowing them up really large, especially here at the Davis, so that you can see it's sort of a map of how you spend your time, of what you're doing with your fingers. And I think that the other invisible thing for me, and this is mainly because of my lovely relationship with my 12-year-old son back there, is we're in this constant war with how much time he's spending on the screens. And it puts my state of mind in this very struggle-oriented place that I think is a metaphor for just all of us trying to push back against technological domination. And so I don't mean that in the AI, robots are going to take over the world way. I mean that in the way that 3 hours of your life can go by when you should have been doing, or it might have been a higher quality 3 hours if you hadn't been sucked into Instagram or Facebook or shopping or whatever we do online, Photoshop in my case. So by using this old analog camera, there was a little bit of sort of frisky empowerment involved in being able to slow my process down. It's much more, to me, I can see the difference in how the light reacts to a piece of negative versus a sensor. But I also felt like it was a way to escape the digital world of photography, which is sort of dominating right now.
Yeah. So I'm wondering, because the images, or at least the content that you're capturing on the screens is all really different. Some of it does represent what you're talking about tonight, which are those, those modes of escape that we have when we go on our phone to Instagram or something, just to have a break from the chaos of life. But it's also more circular than that, right? Because sometimes I go on my phone and that's when I get troubled. I'm thinking about Monday when I held in my hand Notre Dame as it was burning. I was able to watch a live feed of it, and I still had an incredibly emotional reaction to that, which of course comes from my own experience, my memories of being there, my knowledge of the building and what it means for medieval art and history. But that experience nonetheless was mediated by the phone and the screen. So I'm wondering if this project, are you completely disillusioned by
no.
our relationship?
No,
is it a healthy dose of skepticism?
I hope it's a healthy dose of skepticism. I mean, ideally, I just want to, it's not advocacy art by any means. I'm not trying to make value judgments about how people spend their time, but I do think it's worth questioning what we're doing. And in that case, there are reasons that, the Notre Dame, very sad, obviously. And it's very important because it's so old and irreplaceable, right? But I was also thinking about the 3 black churches in Louisiana had been burned down this month. And I think that there is something about the isolation of these images that come at you that make whatever you're looking at the most important thing at that moment. And I think that can influence the way you vote. It can influence the way you think about what's a fact and what's not. I think part of that impulse to make a quick take, a quick judgment on something. I was talking to a New Yorker writer yesterday, and she said that she has to post her takes, 52 takes a year on something for the website there. And I thought, what's a take? Is that an essay? Is it an opinion piece? Is it an editorial? And it was just her spin on something. And I do feel like we respond to all this information coming at us feeling like we have to have this immediate opinion where we might not actually know anything about it. You and Notre Dame are another story because you're an art historian, obviously. But I think that impulsivity got us into, in my opinion, a lot of trouble with the results of the election, and that people were voting, with their emotions rather than with and yes, she still had more votes, just for the record, but I do feel like there was an emotionality to it and an irrationality to it, and I do think this is how we end up with a president who thinks he's entitled to his own set of facts. So that's my 2 cents.
A healthy dose of skepticism.
Yeah, healthy dose of skepticism.
about technology.
But
and...
you know, it is about technology, but I do really like the fact that it relates back to art history for me. I mean, I do think not just to, you know, the view camera and taking pictures under a black hood, but I feel like the smudges, the grime, the bacteria are the way it's illuminated on top of the images. It becomes very spiritual. There's a religiousness to the lighting, and then in addition to all of these digits and the digital, that kind of conflict is in there. But all of the hands and the pictures in the Davis, they're all related to touch. So you have 20 background pictures that we can talk about if you want to, and more specifically, but they're all about touch and hands. And even if it's a landscape. And for me, this directly relates back to the Stone Age cave paintings, whose artists and entourages were, you know, blowing pigments around their hands to make handprints. They're animals too, but mostly actually they're hands. And they're palping this rock I mean, nobody knows exactly why they were doing what they were doing, but certainly, you know, I think of them as trying to reach for something beyond what's in front of them. They're summoning a force beyond it. And I think that when we're staring into screens, we're doing the same thing. And then the being able at this museum to blow them up so large is really allows me to sort of foreground the essence of being a human being, which is that, you know, we're sweaty and messy and oily and dirty, and you can see that, especially if my son has made the markings on the video screen, because his hands get very sweaty when he plays video games on my iPad, and so those are the ones that really glisten. And, you know, it doesn't look like anything I've seen before, even though I know exactly what it is. And when that happened as an artist, I was like, okay, like, let's go further with this.
So I want to go back to the, you briefly mentioned your choice to use analog photography, which is interesting because, of course, in its inception, photography in its earliest iterations was also the latest technology that had the ability to weave fictions about individual lives, about people and their personalities or historical events. But you've specifically chosen to use analog photography to capture digital screens, digital images. And I wonder if you could just explain a little bit more the technical aspects and why you made that choice.
Well,
and how you think it comes through in the images.
I started out, and I'll show you a couple of these later, but I started out with film and a Hasselblad and a much smaller negative, so 2 1/4. And I tried to blow them up as big as I wanted to blow up, and they got all wishy-washy, and the detail wasn't there, and they got very decorative looking. So I really wanted it to be very sharp, very detailed, and so by using an 8x10 camera, I had that size, and that, you know, allows me to make them 5 by 8 feet in your museum. So that was one element to it. The second element I mentioned earlier about just not wanting to have my whole life revolve around my computer. And then the third element is that it slows my day down. So I'm navigating 3 kids, husband, job, lectures, making art, promoting it. It's, you know, like everybody, I feel way too busy. And if you do something analog, you're forced to slow down.
Interesting. So,
and then the other thing, actually, just for us, is that somebody gave me all his old film, like boxes and boxes and boxes and boxes of 8x10 film, which they cost about $10 a sheet. Wow. And it could have all been bad because it was from the 70s, because this guy is a veteran, and he was appalled by the chemicals that are used and the effect they have on the environment. And so he wanted to get rid of them. And so I could experiment and play around without feeling like I was burning money.
Cool. So speaking of experimenting with different processes, you've also worked with Tintypes.
Indeed.
Can you tell us a little bit about that project?
Sure. Tintypes are essentially photographs on metal. I used a dry plate process, and I really feel like if I allow for accident in my work, which I probably shouldn't admit this, I should make it all seem super intentional, but it is intentional in setting up the idea that something really accidentally good might happen. And I was working on a series on baseball players that lasted 15 years, and I could not figure out a way to take an action shot that I hadn't seen 10,000 times. And I did not want to take more heroic, athletic baseball pictures. Yet, the people who I was putting the book together with really thought, you might want to have a couple of pictures of people playing baseball, something from the game. And so I did.
Why baseball?
Well, I felt, let me answer this question and then I'll answer that one because they do relate. So Tintypes and baseball came into the world about 10 years apart. Both the start of each is something that the French argue over, and then the baseball fanatics also argue over when the first baseball game happened and where. But approximately a decade apart. So conceptually it made sense. And action tintypes are just not a thing. And there's a good reason. There's a very good reason why that's the case. It's much easier to take a portrait. So I taught myself how to do it. And sometimes, as you'll see, like the emulsion did not go on very evenly, and it was too thick there. But I felt like it was a religious ecstasy tintype at the end of it. I really preferred it. And then other parts, it wasn't drying flat, so it kind of congealed over there. But I felt like having these imprints of the struggle of making the work was a direct connection to the struggle that these players are going through. So in terms of baseball, the reason I ended up working for this long on a project about athletes was not because I cared anything about baseball. I'm interested in America's myth about manifest destiny and being the best, and the struggle for just working hard, having a dream, and everything is supposed to be okay after that. And I think that as opposed to other sports, baseball has this minor league, all these minor league teams that they play, but only 6% of them get to the majors. And I didn't know that when I started. I kind of thought, after a certain amount of ice baths and dealing with all those mosquitoes in the outfield and bus rides and playing in fields that were downwind of a dog food factory, so that really they could almost not stop themselves from vomiting while they were playing the game, I thought that kind of you would be assured some sort of place on the major league team after all of that, but that's not the case. So the precariousness of their lives, when it really hangs on this perpetual push for self-perfection. Mm-hmm. And I felt like that was a very American thing that I didn't see in the other sports. So I'm using them as a metaphor. And also, another very American thing is to, I don't actually believe that there are no second acts in American life. I actually think there are. I think I'm proof of that. So I was interested in, once they did fail or come up short, and I think 5 of the 21 that I followed got to the majors, and 1 for just 1 game. So the rest of them technically fell short. I was interested in how they, moved on from that, rebuilt themselves and came up with a different identity. And this is not somebody going from, I was an accountant and now I'm a real estate agent. I've been on Little League teams and spending 90% of my time playing this game since I was 5. And now who am I? And they really did not know. So
you stuck with them even after they were done?
I did. I stuck with them. This is what the inside of my studio looked like for about 7 years.
Have any of them shared with you what it was like to have this chronicle of their life made through photographs?
Yes.
What it's like to be
Yes.
documented?
They very early on decided I was like this weirdo who didn't know anything about baseball, and so they were amused by me calling and now I'm getting them confused. It's a uniform. I would call it an outfit. I did this ridiculous thing. Walker loves this story. Should I tell it? Yeah. So I was shooting a Hasselblad for some of this, and you see it's upside down and reversed when you look in the viewfinder. Mm-hmm. And so one of the guys, I was on the pitching mound, and this guy who was I wanted to get everybody doing what they did best, just one shot of why they were drafted, and this guy bunted really well. So he bunted, and the light wasn't great, and I'm standing on the mound, and he went that way and ran to first. And I was like, okay, let's do it again, but this time run this way. You would never run to third, but it wasn't a real game or anything. Yeah, so stuff like that happened. And the weirdo thing, it wasn't that bad of a reputation to have, because what happened was they got injured a lot, right? So, and the pitchers especially had this repetitive motion that caused a lot of bone spurs. And so when they got the bone spurs taken out, and their wives or girlfriends didn't really want them in the house, or, have this leftover from the surgery stuff, they were like, maybe Tabitha would want them. And so by the end of it, I had collected about over 100, and I had enough to make these beautiful sculptures in vitrines, and they became like this celestial night sky, and they were lovely. And I put them on, navy blue velvet, and the whole thing looked super fancy and great. And yet it's such a powerful statement of the sacrifice that Americans are willing to go through to just hit a ball with a stick. Crazy. So I really was there are a lot of pictures that I feel like there are a lot of pictures I've never seen in sports before. So even though I didn't know anything about baseball, even though I didn't even see baseball when I was looking at them, I saw them going through a rite of passage. I think they were interested in this wholly different perspective on their lives, because I didn't know anything. When I look at this picture, they're in the bullpen dealing with this incredible heat. They're on a team called the Nuts, for God's sakes, And I looked at that, and the reason I arranged it the way I did was because I was thinking of the Last Supper painting. The table's in the right level, the lighting is about the same. I don't have the right number of individuals. The Catholics in the audience will be able to tell you that. But the feeling is similar as far as I was concerned. Where? Modesto, California, and the team is called the Modesto Nuts. And their mascots are pistachio, an almond, and a walnut. And the walnut really gets a raw deal because he looks like a butt. Bad. Very bad. Anyway, I found ways to amuse myself.
So you were talking about, and them too, clearly asking him to run to third.
Yes.
Base. So speaking of running, you have a series called Running.
I do.
Do you want to show some of those?
Yes.
Also deals with themes of anxiety and inner conflict.
Yeah, I'm kind of a one-note wonder.
I just walk us through and talk about the
Sure.
process.
This is specifically about the fight or flight response, and they're all staged, and there's usually some sort of surface or filter that you're looking through to get to the subject matter, and the figures are, you can't tell really whether they're arriving or escaping, and chaos and vulnerability are pretty central to all the images. I was trying to make something invisible visible, and scientifically, actually, when you're in that fight or flight response, you actually do go blind and lose your sight. momentarily, of course. So I felt like it was a very useful thing to explore. I think that the movement, in terms of having them run, what it allowed me to do was it provided a certain loss of control and unself-consciousness, because these aren't models, these are just friends who were nice enough to get up at dawn and run through the fog or what have you. And they're wind sprints too, they're not long jogs. It's like, again, again, again.
So these are staged, you're directing them.
Yes.
What kinds of directions do you give people? Like, do you encourage them to think about a moment when they felt like running from a situation?
I
Because
try
sometimes
to
their faces, like when I first saw the series, I couldn't necessarily tell that they were staged, but I also couldn't figure out how you got so many pictures of people running away from nothing that I could see. So,
Right.
Like, what kind of mental state do you get them, and how do you?
Well, sometimes I would give them direction. I never would ask them what it was or tell them what to think about. But if they had something that they were scared of or something that they wanted to get to, some goal or something, I did ask them to think about that. But fact of the matter is, most of them had their own facial expressions based on running 50 times. And I don't think that they necessarily thought of what I cued them, but I felt like it was my job to give them something, I think a lot of times they were thinking, don't fall, don't trip, or don't trip over that thing, or they don't have a lot of time. I mean, there really are sprints. They're very short, so it's not like they have to have a very long-term sort of nightmare in their head to do it. And I think that I was interested in this also because there's so much photography right now that's very fashionable and lovely. There's a real tendency toward abstraction right now, and that taking the figure out of it so the images can be experienced as sort of this inscrutable form. And so running really pushes against that. And I think that it really emptying out the frame of a human also empties it out of some sort of narrative too. And I think that can be a dead end. I don't want to dictate what the narrative is either for the runner or the viewer, but I think that by playing with this quickening pulse of dread and desperation, it does sort of conjure up a visual state or something visual that viewers could relate to. And what do you do when you run? Do you always run successfully? Do you run straight? Do you run crooked? Do you fall? Do you get up? Some of my runners are falling. Some of them are picking themselves up. And I felt like that was really what I wanted to get at. I mean, it's one thing to say resilience, but it's another to sort of see people lose their composure. You could see it in their faces.
So for our students in the room who are studying photography, can you talk about that decision to do a series that involves performance, and how you might have one idea as a photographer of how it's going to come out and what it's going to look like, and then what actually happens when you ask, like you said, friends, not
right. Well,
actors to perform for you?
I mean, I think it's my responsibility to have a very specific idea in mind, but be open to something else happening and it changing. And in all these best pictures, it did not come out the way that I had it in my head. I mean, God forbid, this poor woman. My mom was there on this shoot. You didn't stay till the very end though when she got out. She was running through this water, and I had to take a lot of them because the boys were being boys, and they're making gang signs and, doing stupid Berkeley things to pretend they, were tough guys and didn't really live in granola Berkeley. But when she got out of this water, she was covered in leeches. It was so gross. So the whole time she's running, and they were flesh-colored too, which I had never seen before. And so some of that she must have been aware of during the running back and forth all that time. And if I had known, obviously, I would not have had her continue. But so lots of stuff can happen. In this case, in the San Francisco shot, it was pouring when I got there. And I thought, okay, well, we'll take different pictures. There won't be any. And the house was under construction. You know, it's like, ugh, all these rafters. And I thought, okay, well, then I'll get on the construction scaffolding, which is why it's such a weird vantage point. And then once it stopped raining, all the streets were shiny and glistening, and it made the picture that much better. But did I know that going in? Like, no, you have to constantly be sort of juking and jiving if you've asked someone to take some time away from their day. But in some cases, I'm so far away, what they're thinking about doesn't really matter. And as you can see, the process is pretty low rent. It's not Gregory Crutzen. I do not have a whole movie set of people like figuring out very specific light and filters and all the rest. It's me in pigtails so that it doesn't fall in my hair frame, and on a little step stool in, I think this is Oxford or Cambridge, one or the other. And then in Berkeley, this tree that I had stared at and thought was the creepiest thing ever for years, I saw that it was going to be torn down by a construction site. This guy that we carpooled with was an actor, so he was home during the day. He came over for a half hour. I had him run and fall 20 times. I used my car as my ladder, and bibbity-bobbity boom, we got that guy. So, and it's gone now. I mean, there's like a fancy Oakland condo there. So it was good that I bothered.
So it seems like there's an unpredictability to the process that kind of mirrors the unpredictability
there is.
The work that you're trying to get at. And
why I'm so cool as a cucumber psychologically. I'm like, you know, very laid back.
For sure.
Sure.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about the unpredictability and these issues of panic or stress or fight or flight.
Sure, it's my wheelhouse. There is one thing though about the running pictures. Like, yeah, I think that you're right in that they're a staged act of an individual terror. Mm-hmm. And an individual panic, but I feel like if you look at them in a series, I do feel like they sort of accumulate into this sort of cultural feeling of paranoia and reactiveness, and I feel like the political situation sort of almost amps the feeling of these pictures up quite a bit. I mean, if you think of the start of the 21st century as the towers going down, and then, you know, every vision of the future that I interact with in a newspaper article or documentary or a lecture, it's always apocalyptic. And I feel like there is this accumulation of sort of a cultural paranoia that happens in these pictures that takes it away from just the running.
The individual.
And yeah.
Aren't these named individual names?
They are. I felt like it was, you know, titles are tricky, but I felt like there was a way.
Like this is named after the woman who's.
Yeah, Janelle. I wanted not only to pay tribute to the person who's doing me the favor, but also by the picture having a name, I felt like the viewer had a way in. So that they weren't stuck at is it real or not real? Is it staged, or is like she just spying on all these people or what? So I wanted you to be able to get past that, and by knowing the person's name, well, then they must have been complicit in the process. So I felt like that was a clue. So I wanted to get at and having one, really most of the time, 99% of the time, there's just one person in there, right, getting at the loneliness of fear. But as a group, I feel like they really get at the sort of reactive climate of this American moment.
So talking about kind of, I don't know, like our collective panic or our collective anxieties, do you take or get most of your ideas for these projects from the outside world, or are they from more personal experiences? Like this is a great example. This series is called Panic Beach. Mm-hmm. So did your own panic lead to this, or was it something
Certainly
else
helps.
Yeah. I mean, I know you said you were cool as a cucumber.
Yes. So I think I experience things, and then I will take a picture because from studying art history, I guess, I know, I have this visual education. I know when I have an opportunity to take a good picture. Mm-hmm. And then I take the picture, and then I try to take more like that, and then it occurs to me that this is what this is about. It's not always first. And I think when it has been the idea first, they haven't been as successful. Mm-hmm. I think that as I get older, it is very striking what people survive and what people don't at the same time. You lose more people as you have more years on the planet. And so the Panic Beach oceanscapes are an attempt to upend the viewer the way that panic attacks do. Do you have to have a panic attack and know that it's about panic attacks to understand them or appreciate them? I don't think so. I think that the ocean is something that captivates people for a lot of different reasons. And I think that the compelling colors pull you in. I think the ferociousness of the water pulls you in. And I was trying to take the horizon lines, put the horizon lines all in the same place. But then, am I going to lose that picture? That picture because it doesn't have one? Nah, I was kind of unwilling to do that because that one to me looks the most like a tornado. So then I realized also I wasn't very happy with the square because I felt like it was containing the energy in a way that a rectangle wouldn't. Mm-hmm. And so I started taking some that are rectangular, and I really felt like the difficult twists and turns of everyday living were reflected in a picture like that. And then lately I've been going really dark.
So just in the short time we have left, while we're talking about process mm-hmm. and, the impulse to explore something and then it turning into a bigger idea, I wonder if we can look at your latest.
Sure. Well, I realize I have a couple of slides here that answer the question you were trying to lead me to. I'm sorry. That's my bad. And I'll just flip through them really quickly. So in terms of the ideas of where they come from, like, yes, there's a thought process and it evolves and you keep shooting and you change the meaning and you see what ones are working, what aren't. But like this is a surface tension image. And I think that, I know definitely are mad geniuses who are artists, but I think most of us are actually not that unhinged. We actually might just remember things better or have like this knack for visual things sticking in our heads. Because when I look at this picture, I can't say that it didn't have anything to do with this Turner painting, and then these early surface, I don't mean to make myself seem like a mimic or something, but these early surface tension black and white images, the Hasselblad ones, I'm not sure if I would have thought twice. Most of you just wipe it off on your phone, right? And the fact that I was sitting under a really harsh light on an airplane helped, but I'm not sure I would have thought of that as anything more than grime and bacteria and something to get out of the way if I didn't know Franz Klein's work. So you make these connections, and I think it's important. That's one of the reasons it's so important to get a visual education. It doesn't have to be through a university, obviously, but it all seeps in. If you allow yourself to be a sponge, you will be. And reading also, if you're working on a long-term project, and I really think that the scientific studies that I delved into for surface tension, did it impact every single picture I took? No, but it gave me momentum throughout because I felt like there was somebody that I was in conversation with, even though it was a scientist who didn't know I existed. It gives you a way to navigate something that otherwise you might just feel like you're all by yourself. So this picture, one of the people I read, in addition to Virginia Heffernan Magic and Loss, and Astra Taylor, and P.W. Singer's Like War, and E.M. Forster, at turn of the century wrote something about how technology was going to ruin us all, called The Machine Stops. So this is not like, just the concern of this very moment. But Margaret Atwood wrote this poem called I think it's called You Begin, and it goes like this. Let's see if I can get it right. This is the world which is fuller and more difficult to learn than I have said. You are right to smudge it that way, with the red and the orange. The world burns. My head almost exploded. Like, you know, you're all by yourself in your studio for days at a time. Nobody's looking at anything you're making. And then you read this little poem before bed and you think, I am a genius. So there you are. So the last bit, yes, this is the work you wanted me to talk about.
Yeah. So Lisa and I were really lucky to see this in person back in November, and I was really struck by it because, you know, at first, when you first see it on one level, it seems to have really clear connections to surface tension, literally because Tabitha here is playing with the surface. She's all those white specks are her poking through or ripping or tearing the surface of the photograph, which, when you say it, sounds destructive, but in fact, I think looking at it, you see that they're incredibly carefully composed and very subtle marks and perforations on the page. So in that way, it's not like surface tension because there's so much that's haphazard to those smudges on the screens, whereas here this seems really careful. And so I wonder if you could just talk about how you came to this, the process, what you're thinking, how you're working through it.
I don't know exactly what this work is about yet. I'm not sure if it relates to a psychological state yet, because that kind of meaning tends to show up toward the end. But in terms of Carrie's questions, certainly I think it's a reaction to digital photography. I really wanted to make something with my hands. I really wanted something that wasn't going to be, there weren't going to be multiples because each one is handmade. Mm-hmm. I was interested in the idea that the world is 3D and these cameras make it 2D. And I thought, well, what if I made it 3D again? And so I added some scans on top. I shot it with a pellet gun at first inside my studio. That was a mistake. And I carved them. I do a whole bunch of different things. They are, sometimes they're like a crazy person just hitting the back of it. And then sometimes it's very, very, very detail and careful. And I think that it's sort of a reaction to everything or this very important thing that everyone is taught about photography, and that the camera is this unmistakable eye, that the lens allows light to hit the negative and make these light traces, and then at the end of that you have proof, and you have that, the perfect photographic moment. And I think that this allows me to compress a bunch of different frames into one frame, a bunch of different ideas and levels, and also gets away from that rule. It breaks the rules. You're not sure what you're looking at. The shadow, if it's lit the right way, the shadow becomes yet another element in the image. Is that a diptych? Yeah, okay, sorry.
Any rhyme or reason to the source images and then the types of marks you make on them?
Yes, there is. Not a heck of a lot, but a little. I'm sure it'll. Once I have time to think more directly about it or spend a little more time with it. But what I'm trying to do is take something very familiar, like a landscape or a portrait, and have the viewer have to make it a particular, precise thing of their own. They think they know what they're looking at, but then they're not actually, they don't know what they're looking at. And by changing up something very traditional, I thought that allowed the viewer to see, sort of try to grasp the ungraspable. By me having these attempts at trying to make a picture we haven't seen before, it is another attempt to make the invisible visible. Yeah.
I'm excited to see where it goes.
Yeah, me
Thank you,
too.
Tabitha.
Me too.
It's almost 7:00, so I think we should open it up to questions from the audience.
You're so articulate, and I'm so glad you're here. Your work is wonderful. I just wanted to delve, it's sort of a surface topic, but I noticed there was one photo of Harvey Weinstein, I think, in the Star.
Yeah, that was him.
And then your 15-year study of the baseball players. The reason I bring them up together is, do all of your ideas, are you commissioned ever to do things, or was the Harvey Weinstein thing a paparazzi kind of thing?
I couldn't give that picture away. Nobody wants to hang that in their house.
But I mean, what gave you access to the baseball players? What made them want to?
Oh, well, those are two different questions. All the pictures in surface tension are appropriated from the internet, or people have sent them to me digitally, JPEGs, never on request, just, here, look, I went here on vacation. I get it in a text. Some of the landscapes are like that. So the Harvey Weinstein was a picture in a news article that I wrote.
Oh, so you didn't take the photo?
No, I didn't take any of the pictures in surface tension. Those are all from my web. So you go back into the way that I picked them, I would go back into my web search or my web history for that month or however long the grime was building up on the iPad, and then just play around with the light and the fingerprints and see, which ones would work. So, and then I guess I should have said this in the beginning, but the titles are all links back to the home image. So if the website hasn't been adjusted or updated, it will bring you back to the picture of Harvey Weinstein, depending on what the title is. But the picture of the girl blowing the kiss is an image that my daughter took when I was out of town to kiss me goodnight. It didn't occur to her to pick up the phone and actually say, tell me how her day was or whatever, but she just put the iPad up, clicked it, and then sent me a JPEG, and I felt like that was a way that some of our intimacy with other people is being stolen because technology has made it so easy to communicate other things. I mean, she does get credit for wanting to kiss me goodnight, but so they don't all come from websites. Sometimes it's somebody I know who has sent me. I mean, we're all communicating with images now as much as emoticons and.
But you took the baseball series.
Yes, yes, I've taken all the pictures. I mean, I don't think I have any other appropriated ones. Yeah, so the baseball series, my husband wrote a book about baseball, and I met this draft class at the very first day of their spring training, and I had just seen Renika Dijkstra's images of Israeli soldiers at SF MoMA, and she does all these, there's a Dutch photographer who does all these series of people over time, and I thought, when do you have access to a group of young men who are all about to embark on the same exact journey at the exact same time and all be the same age? And so that, even though I could have cared less and did not want to be at spring training, I thought, well, I'll bring my camera equipment and maybe something will happen.
And I'll end here because I don't want to take over the job, but I've been to spring training. I hate it too. I go with my kids or my husband. But it's pretty intense, and I'm surprised they took time out to do that. You must have worked your...
I knew the boss. Yeah, I knew the manager of the whole team. So, and I mean, it was their first year. The only star at that time was Nick Swisher in my group. So they're all happy to kill the boredom. They don't have a dime to spend money or do anything. So, I mean, one of my favorite pictures, if you can just, going the wrong way, close your eyes, is this picture that looks like it has nothing to do with baseball, and they don't have time to do anything but play cards and hang around these motels, and there's 3 or 4 of them to a room sometimes, so they don't want to be in the room either, so they're in the hotel pool. And I felt like we always think of athletes as these, superheroes that are triumphant until their fortunes turn, and then they're drowning heroes. And this one I print really big so that it does have that power to it. But yeah, it is boring. And it's not intense until the end. Like the beginning games, people are like, eh. Go ahead.
An image like that, or your Panic Beach, do you manipulate for the color? Do you?
No. I mean, yeah. I adjust it in Photoshop.
Yeah.
I don't. I mean, I'm sure I do some. I mean, it's not a big part of my process. But I can't say, like, if you looked at the raw file of this, it would look exactly the same. And, skin tone is skin tone. But I certainly, and even in the, Carrie and I talked about me using the view camera and using an analog process for surface tension. That doesn't mean there's absolutely no digital work in that project. Those prints are digital because they're enormous, and it would have cost, I would have had to sort of set up a whole studio to make mural prints analog that way, and most of those places in San Francisco have closed. And there are ways now that you are just trapped into a digital world because all of the analog places are out of business. And if you are a blue chip artist, you can just assemble it all back together and hire the people and whatever, but that's not really my world yet. So, anything else?
Yeah.
Hi.
I really love your work, and thank you so much for coming, first of all.
Thank you.
I was wondering in surface tension. I know that the images are taken after the grime has built up and that it's not in connection to how the photos were being looked at, but because that is so much a part of the digital experience, it's kind of how we're zooming in and interacting with the images. I'm wondering if in your process of going through the different images that you're pulling up, if there is any consideration for how the grime...
Well, it definitely affects the selection of the image into the final project, how well those two, the motion and the background image are working together. And for the Davis, Lisa and I picked the ones where the background image related to touch. So this doesn't have a finger in it, but Greenland is shrinking because of human touch of that country. And, that is arson. So in answer to your question, it affects how I edit them, but not how I shoot them. And I can light them in a way that is, this takes a couple of times because I can't see what I'm shooting while I'm shooting it because it's analog and there's no monitor. And the light it's a long exposure, which is why what I am showing you on surface tension is not what you see on your phones, because that light is probably a second or two of exposure, right? So the light is building up and those highlights get really bright, which I then also scan and then, accent or lower depending on, what I want. So I can do it in a couple of different ways. But in terms of choreographing the fingerprints themselves, no. Does that make sense? I liked that those kind of looked like bubbles, even though it was clearly like smears in a way, right? And then this one, the real technical problem of these is that the light gets too hot, and I can't see that it's making a huge hot spot. And so a lot of them are just trashed because of that. That and having the focus, it's such a thin, a tiny depth of field that I'm trying to get in focus that I blow that sometimes too. But in this case, the hot spot I thought ended up in an interesting place, so I kept it. Most of the time, though, it just ruined the picture. Does that answer your question? Okay. Yes.
So it's unbelievable to me that you were able to follow these guys for 15 years, and what a fascinating, when we ever get to do that.
I wasn't on the, I do have 3 kids. I just met them a couple of times a year. I wasn't living with them.
But I wonder, especially given your background, if you interviewed them as well, or if you...
No, I did notice that it was such a relief, such a pleasant experience, not sitting there wondering how can I get them to say this or that, or, when the guys let go. All I have to do is take the shot of him looking crushed. I don't actually say, how does it feel to be a loser? It was actually really lovely not having to think about that. And then when I went to do the book, I thought there needed to be some narrative because I wanted the point made that it wasn't just about baseball. And at the same time, it allowed you to enjoy the book more if you knew about the people. There were two famous baseball players who made millions and millions of dollars in there, so some people might have known who they were, but the rest of them, in my mind, were just as important. So at some point, I was going to write little ditties about each one who ended up in the book, and we limited that to 10. But then and this is so my bad, I had them send me some material that they would want to include. And they were all so well written and so good, and their voices were so clear. I didn't end up writing them. I ended up I helped them edit it, or I pushed them harder. And when I knew they were alluding to something, and I would just say they paid you $900 for the whole year, or so that journalistic part of my brain was still active, but it was nice to be able to only worry about the visual and thinking about what the hard part was, challenging it to be something more than a picture of a person on a mound. To this day, this guy, I love this picture so much, and it's the only tintype I won't sell. This one. Again, the emulsion, wrong. Like, it's supposed to be flat. And it turned blue because the humidity was a particular whatever, it's like I'm basically teaching myself how to do this, so I don't know the mistakes I'm not supposed to make. And I showed it to this guy because I was so happy with it. And he's like, "Don't you have any of me pitching?" I felt like it was this guy about to go to heaven and have this religious experience, and he knew exactly what game it was. He's like, "I was just watching that foul ball go up, so boring." I was very underappreciated.
It looks like it could be 100 years old. It's just timeless.
Yeah, the short pants help too, right?
Yeah, Pat.
Yeah, a couple of things. I'm just really intrigued, particularly by these tintypes. So there are two quotes I want to bring forth, and I think that they're super interesting in terms of your work. One you probably know, Juliana Bruno's book, Surface.
Mm-hmm.
Where she says surface is where the visual meets the thinkable, right? And the other, so I'm going to hold on to that.
Okay.
The other is actually a quote from the 1920s. Virginia Woolf wrote a film was criticizing cinema, and she said that cinema is when the tongue of your eyeball reaches out and licks the screen. I want to take these two things and
Wow.
just say, because there's a total difference between your representations and the way these players are playing. Because your stuff is so much about representation, and I see so many of your surfaces as interrupters in representation, and which is what I find incredibly beautiful and interesting. In the tintypes especially, I love you're talking about accident, because it's that thing that makes the surface a palpable thing. Because I guess what Virginia Woolf was saying, we look at images and we just eat them. We just eat them without thinking. Like our eyeballs
Right.
take them in without
Right.
any consciousness. I want to hear a little bit more about the consciousness of all these interrupters, the fingers, the emulsion.
I think that the newest work embodies those ideas the most, because the markings, the cuttings, the scans, the things I'm adding to, I'm calling it beauty mark right now, but that's not what it's going to be ultimately. Went backwards again. I think, I wish I had more to say about it. It's not something I was even aware that was consistent in my work until a curator came over and he's like, surface, 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 all the same. I was like, what? The tintypes, because when the baseball book came out, a lot of art world types were not interested in it because, really, we're saturated with those images of sports people all the time. Why would you let it, sort of invade the art world? And also, perhaps, they were beaten up by athletes when they were in high school. It's not out of the realm of possibility. But I felt like in the Tintypes, the first time I dropped one and then had to pick it up and it slipped out of my hands again, it was a player's face, and I ended up framing the guy's face with my fingerprints, which I'm sure informed the next project, which was surface tension. But the indexicality of the artist on top of the work was something to me that made it feel, it just emphasized the materiality of it, that these are objects, and I mean, you're not like, you deal with a lot of other art besides photography, so you're not pushing up against that as much. But in my world, I'm constantly, I do feel like the object of the work that I make is to remain an object. And so by having these different layers that you can't necessarily take with an iPhone or what have you, I'm sure that's in there somewhere. But I also do feel like it makes the viewer slow down. I'm not licking them yet, though. Just
Will you stop us from licking them? You made us think. Because of the interruptions, I think it's super interesting.
I think there is a question here.
So I kind of just alluded to this, but is the surface and the tactility something that you do because you find it artistically interesting, or is it because is it something, like, are you always conscious when you're working about the viewer's experience interacting with the photograph and experiencing it? Is like that constantly?
I don't think I'm 100% consistent about any of the points that you brought up, but I have experienced all of those things. I definitely think that a lot of contemporary art is off-putting and purposefully trying to baffle people. And so anything that I could do to give viewers an entry point, I think is important to me. And I don't do it I hope I don't, it's not obvious necessarily by looking at it, but I think that the more tactile something seems, the more you're drawn to it, the more, I don't know, that you have to slow down and figure it out. I think that, what was the other thing that you said? You had a middle point that I wanted to explain, and now I can't think of what it is.
But if you're creating an entry point, but at the same time, you're creating a barrier.
Right, that's true. But I didn't realize, the Tintypes, me having, the Tintypes, I'm not going to flash through the frame, but they're supposed to look a particular way, and I was aiming for that way. And I made ones with no bubbles at some point, because the emulsion was coming out uneven. I shook the hell out of the bottle, which puts all this air in it, and so then you pour that on there and you get like bubble face, and those are really distracting, and that's not what I've seen in museums either. And so you just keep going back and doing it over and over, and then I made the perfect ones, and I was like, those look like the ones I've already seen. I don't want to do those. I actually like the messed up ones better. And so I feel like in addition to surface, it's really about my attraction to things being uncertain and incomplete, or maybe falling short. That the lack of seeking out imperfection is where all my projects collide. That is more interesting to me. So the messiness of the surface tension, of not being able to get to the perfect image underneath, and the fingerprints and the bubbles and the thick emulsion on the Tintypes. But that wasn't intentional. It's just about, my bodies of work, like my runners are falling, and my baseball players have bubbles on them and handprints, and then surface tension is about sweat and grime, and how imperfect human beings are compared to these shiny, beautiful devices. So that's just a theme that's in my brain and heart, and you can't stop it from coming out, I guess. And if And if I was interested in the same subject matter over and over, I think it might be a problem because it would just be redundant.
I think that response is a really nice way to wrap up our conversation tonight. So thank
Okay.
you so much, Tabitha, and I encourage everyone to join us across the street and continue the conversation.